now, and welcoming everybody to BioBites. This is the June BioBites 2024. My name is Jessica Frank, and I'm the Biological Medicine Program Manager at the Marion Institute. Of course, for those who are new to BioBites, this is our monthly free educational series. BioBites connects you with some of the foremost experts in alternative health and natural healing and in biological medicine today. We are going to be just doing a couple of housekeeping before we begin with our presentation. First, please keep mics muted during the first half of the recording, and then let us know where you're coming from in our chat. So you're welcome to open up your chat function and let us know where you're joining us from. We love to see that. And in the second part of today's webinar, so the first part is, of course, Rita's presentation, and then the second part will be our Q&A portion where Rita can answer questions that you ask, and you will always ask those in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on those as they arise, and we'll get to those in the second half. And let's see, I'll go ahead and announce that our next BioBites will be in August. We're going to skip July, but we're going to go into August with a special event called Hold It to Heal It, Healing Trauma and Disease with Biological Medicine. And that will be on Tuesday, August the 6th at 12 noon. And this episode will feature Dr. Dixon Tom as well as his daughter, Julie Tom. She's a trauma-informed movement specialist. She'll be speaking about trauma, disease, the brain protocol treatment, and ways to heal the past by looking at the present. So this is a special preview of their in-person 3-day workshop coming up at the fabulous retreat center Omega, the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York, which is October 26th through 28th. We have a lot of amazing upcoming events, and they are closely related. The first is the June 27th, our event with Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, the author of The Body Keeps the Score, speaking about mind-body healing from trauma. And the second, kind of related to today's topic, is that our month-long Eat Local South Coast Challenge is happening, where we will provide you with resources to eat within a 200-mile radius from June 24th, and that's a whole month, June 24th through July 27th. So make sure you're getting our emails because you don't want to miss those other events that we've got going on. So follow us on your social channels, and we'll also drop links into the chat for registration for any of those events that interest you. Last, we have recording today's presentation. That recording will be sent to your inboxes, hopefully tomorrow, along with some extra resources and the PowerPoint slides as well. All right, so today's topic, it's all about fighting climate change where we live, via landscapes, via gardens, via backyards. With us is MI's Director of Food Access and Innovation, Rita Higgins. Rita is a graduate of McGill University, where she studied environment and international development. Rita has a diverse background in food and non-food related work, ranging from forestry to landscape design to food production in both Ireland in upstate New York, and even into local politics, where she was a member of the Nantucket Select Board. Rita's focus has been on the human connection to land through the built environment, and a focus that she has explored through landscape design over 15 years. And 5 years ago, the essential nature of our connection to the land and to each other and our impact on the environment through food became a motivating factor for her to become more involved in the world of food. This was coupled with the opportunity to take over an upstate New York family-owned garlic farm and kitchen operations for a winter, an opportunity which highlighted the massive systemic supply chain issues that can prohibit small local producer success and prevent eating healthfully, seasonally, and sustainably. She brought these experiences and observations with her back to Nantucket and founded Pip and Anchor and 100 Mile Markets, 2 businesses that focus on making finding and buying local food easier. Fun fact about Rita, at one point in her career, planting and growing things, she was lowered into remote wooded areas via helicopter with just a backpack and about 4,000 baby trees. Okay, so on that note, without further delay, I am going to hand it over to Rita for her presentation on how at-home gardens fight climate change.
Thank you, Jess. And yes, that was a formative experience. Even now, just as in, I wasn't worried as much about survival as I should have, but we're working on that now. So I'm just going to share my screen. And I just want to let everyone know that, again, as Jess said, we will have time for questions at the end. If anything pops up during, do please just throw them into the chat and we'll come back to them. And what I really am going to do to start is build on what Jess explained. You kind of hit the high notes of how I've ended up here at the Marion Institute, working on food equity and working on projects with the South Coast Food Policy Council. But when it comes to landscapes, climate change, what we can do at the small scale, I just wanted to dive a little bit deeper to talk about really how I started and how I got here around climate change. So for me, I've been thinking about climate change for a long time, and it did have to do with growing up in upstate New York in a very rural area, very rural, semi-rural area at the foothills of the Adirondacks. And when I went up to university in Montreal, which is an amazing city, in my first year, I really, I had a sense of loss, and I couldn't figure out what it was. Obviously, moving from the country to the city is a big change. But there was just something I couldn't quite put my finger on. And over the first year, I realized I missed nature. I missed trees. I missed that everyday contact with the natural world. And at the same time, I was also starting to see the effects that urban spaces have on the environment. And in that first year, I shifted from more politics to environmental studies. And that's where I really started to see and understand how the way we live affects the environment and how climate change, this was 20 plus years ago, we were already really seeing signs of climate change and the effects that the way that we've built our lives around resources, connection to nature has caused this climate change. And so as I changed my degree and went through 4 years and got dropped into forests, and really forestry was very formative, because when I started working in forestry, I thought I was planting trees, and planting trees is a good thing. When I saw how we planted them and saw what we were replacing the forests with, the virgin forests up in Canada, replacing them with trees spaced exactly 6 feet apart, only 3 species, and everything beneath them being mowed, I realized that the replacement is not enough. That's not really reforestation. That's planting, that's farming. And that for me, it was when I really felt that in this big hairy beast of thinking about climate change, that is a global issue, it's also very hyper local, and it's about what we are doing every day. And it's about how we are thinking about nature and a relationship with nature. And for me, what I felt at that point in time was the most important thing I could do for climate change was to do anything that was related to changing our relationship with nature. And again, because it can start on a windowsill or out your window or on a balcony or in your backyard, I really started focusing on landscapes. And so I started landscape design, I did green roofing, I looked at urban spaces, I looked to see how we can connect to nature and change our relationship to the land and to nature through the garden. And the idea is that if we can think about it, if we can be inspired by it, if we can understand nature and ecosystems and seasons, we can start to be proactive. So rather than waiting for someone to tell us you can put in an energy saving light bulb or you can do this, if we start to understand what's going on and we reconnect to nature, for some people connect to nature, we can start to actually affect climate change more proactively. And so for many years, I did landscape design. And as Jess mentioned, I did it in a couple different countries, a couple different places, urban, rural, loved it. And really, one morning, 2016, I woke up and I felt like this isn't enough. Climate change it's exacerbated. We're seeing more shifts. I can see it as a gardener. Anyone who's working in their garden spaces, you can see the changes happening. And I also realized that what I think was that more important relationship to nature was food. and that the food on our plate is actually the most important relationship we have to nature. Everything about our food, for the most part right now, the how it's grown, what's being grown, who's growing it, where it's being grown, when it's being grown, why it's being grown, are all totally out of line with natural systems and are having an impact on climate change. And so I started to shift my focus towards food and thinking about how we connect to food and how that connection to food is an important part of our connection and reconnection to nature, and ultimately, again, impacting climate change. What's been funny is that over the years, for the last 5 years at least, I've been working really hard to separate the two, moving away from ecological landscape design into food. And with the Marion Institute, this project that I'm working on over the last year, Frogfoot Farm, and it's taken me a year to really realize that those two are intrinsically and intimately connected. And so everything that I've learned doing ecological design, I'm now able to apply to Frogfoot Farm. And this is the project that I've been working on here at the Marion Institute over the last year. It's at a very high level. You can see the farm right in here. It's land that has been leased to us by the 80 Makepeace Company. So you can see the cranberry bogs all around it. And the focus of the farm is to grow food for food pantries. So it's farm to food relief, and we're doing that by growing on this area here. We'll be gleaning, so we'll be taking food from other farms that otherwise would go to waste, and we'll be getting that into food pantries. And it will be volunteer driven. So we're really going to engage the public and ask everyone to come with us. And really, this is a journey. This is about climate change. It's about building soil health. It's about connecting to your food, to the beautiful landscape around us. And for me, it has been this opportunity again to bring food and landscapes together. Today, we're going to focus on the landscape piece, but if you want to find out more about eating local, I'm going to give a plug for our Eat Local South Coast Challenge. Chris put the link in the bio, and we'll dive deeper on why eating local is important and how that impacts climate change. And you can also sign up to be a volunteer at Frogfoot. So those are my two plugs. But this has been an amazing opportunity, again, to bring these really important pieces together. And now, as a volunteer-driven farm, we'll be able to continuously share this with everyone that joins us. So the question becomes, how do you really take those principles? We're applying these principles at the farm scale. How do we bring them into the backyard? And one of the first steps, just introducing everyone to an important ecological concept called a shifting baseline. And that's gradual change in our accepted norms and expectations for the environment across generations. What that really means in practice is that the house that I grew up in upstate New York had pear trees and mulberry trees and native maples and native oak and native birch. When I go back to Saratoga, upstate New York now, someone has pulled out all the trees, paved over the landscape, and turned it into a parking lot. So when I show my son, what he's seeing is this 2019 version here in the graphic. I know the 1950 version, and what I don't even know is this 1800 version. And so it's shifting our norms. And when we talk about climate change and what we're thinking about, if I've never seen that 1950 version, if all I've known is the 2019 version, I don't even know what I'm saving, what is supposed to be there, what was there before. And so this has become an important part when we're thinking about how are we thinking about the landscape, how are we seeing what we're seeing. Another very simple example that I know a lot of people my age have come across is, again, that when the house that they grew up in, when they grew up, there was a forest behind them. And when they go back, there's 30, 40, 50 houses behind them. So again, when you bring grandkids to that house, all they know is that built landscape. And so they don't even know what was there before. And so that's kind of the first part. I think one of the things that is a good mindset to have around gardens and climate change, because both can be overwhelming, is curiosity. So taking deep breaths, maintain a curiosity mindset, and think about what we really need to do if you want to impact climate change right in your backyard is change our relationship to nature. We need to shift our relationship. So much of gardening has been the last 200 plus years in this country and beyond, as long as gardening's been around, has been about control and has been about what we want. And so shifting that relationship to one that is going to be more adaptive to climate change really requires us to think about three main concepts. The first is observation, second is time and time scales, and three is shifting our priorities. So when it comes to observation, the first thing you can do is just stop and watch. Think about what was here before, what wants to be here, who else is using my garden besides me, and just watch for a season, watch for several seasons. Think about that shifting baseline is what we're seeing is not what was here before, and it's not typically what wants to be here. This picture is my own backyard that I've let go for 2 years. We bought the property 2 years ago, and it had been maintained agriculturally for 100 years. And I just wanted to know, one, I didn't have the time to do anything about it, but two, I wanted to know what would happen, what wants to come back. And for 2 years, this goldenrod here has been reestablishing itself. And so a lot of times with observation, again, the native plants, nature wants to be there. And if we just stop and watch for a second, we start to understand our landscape better. And understanding that landscape is really the first step. These are two books. I have inserted some books and resources throughout. These are two books that really talk about that connection to place, that observation, how we think about our connection to nature and the land around us, and are great resources for thinking about that high-level concept connection to the nature right outside our door and observation. Second is time, and time happens in the garden at the micro scale, and time really, when we're talking about from the garden to climate change, we really have to adjust how we think about time. So much of how we treat our landscape at the moment has to do with speed and convenience. How quickly can I get my lawn to grow? How quickly can I get plants to establish in greenery? This is a picture of my own front porch with some foxglove that took 2 years to grow. And you just had to sit there and wait and be patient, especially when we are taking a step back, observing, learning to slow down and not try and fertilize everything and change everything. We need to take the time to observe, take the time to let things establish. And there's a saying in the gardening world, roots, shoots, and grows. So everything in my experience in gardening definitely takes 3 to 5 years. And so part of this too is when you start to try and shift towards a more climate-friendly gardening, it takes longer than you think. If you try and maintain your lawn more organically or naturally or chemical-free, it will take 3 years for sort of the lawn to repair and to really start thriving again. And so they say roots, shoots, grow. So your first year, your roots, it's establishing roots. Second year is shoots, and the third year is grows. And that's time at that plant scale and that garden scale. But again, in the grand scale of climate change, natural time scale is so much longer than what we typically think about. And just reflecting on time and how we think about it, outside our window is really important. And again, part of that overarching concept of looking at the land and nature around us. Next is, I couldn't help but bring up the crayons, but really, really important for anyone who's done garden design, has read garden design books. This left-hand side of these scales is right now mainstream how we think about gardening. It's about aesthetics. It's about what I want to see out my window, focal points, what color plants I like, what color plants I don't like. I have a garden party in July. I want everything to be blooming in July. So a combination of primarily aesthetics. Then there's the human function. I want my patio here. I want my grill over here. Budget and maintenance, and those being linked. The concepts on the right are the ones where the concepts these are the ones that we want to start to really introduce into our thinking as we're thinking about what we can do in our backyard for climate change. And it's carbon emissions, biodiversity, habitat, food source, minimal inputs, soil health, pollinators. These rarely and almost never get any credence up until about, I would say, in the last maybe 5 to 10 years. Garden design has been entirely about aesthetics, maintenance budget, and human function. So what we need to do in order to shift the way we relate to our landscape and to nature and how we carry that into the garden is shift those priorities. And here I'm showing them balanced. So all of a sudden, those four main sort of pieces that are part of typical gardening and landscapes of conventional landscapes, they're balanced with more of these pieces. And I would really consider this the tiptoeing into gardening for climate change, because what we really need to be doing is really focusing on, when you think about what is going in your garden, you're thinking about habitat, food source, and diversity. Those are the three most important concepts. And if I was to draw this one more time, I would draw those circles really big, and they would outweigh everything else. Everything else falls into place. And so what we need to do is really think about how the way we've been treating our landscape in our backyards, or really in our backyards, if we're connecting it to gardening, is again this imposition of what we want and our priorities in the garden with our time scales. And that is what is part of the driver of climate change. Interesting fact is that there's approximately 2.5 million acres of vegetable production in the States. There's 40 million acres of lawn. So thinking about how what we do in our backyard as part of that 40 million acres is intensely important. Lawn has become one of the biggest crops that we grow. And so the way we think about what we're doing in our backyard becomes part of this coordinated, collaborative effort to shift towards landscapes that are better for the environment. And I have a picture here. This is a project that I did years ago, and it really kind of captures all of those pieces. So we tore out a bunch of lawn, and this is a native meadow. It took 3 years to establish. The first 2 years were horribly unaesthetic and painfully slow to establish. And all of us had to be patient. I knew it would take that long, but we still had to pep talk ourselves into knowing that roots, shoots, grows, change takes time. The way we observed the landscape for a year, and we figured out what native plants were thriving. We understood the lay of the land, where water was coming from, shade. So we observed over time. And then this photo on the right now. So this is one piece too that I talk to people about a lot, is the aesthetics piece. Because again, because we've been gardening for aesthetics, this is not something that everyone thinks is beautiful. So, we're stepping away, we're shifting away from the aesthetics. But when you look closer, and so this is that observation piece too, is when you walk through this meadow, right now it looks green and not much is going on. But when you walk closer and you slow down, there are quite a few flowers. And so this project really reinforced that idea of it takes time, observation, spend more time observing in your garden, and you find those moments of joy and beauty and aesthetics redefined. And this is now an incredible habitat for birds and butterflies and vertebrates and things that we don't even know. These are 2 books if you want to know more specifically about some of those overarching concepts and putting them into play. These are 2 wonderful books that talk a lot about those kind of high-level concepts of observation, time, and really shifting priorities and how to do that. So the next question is where to start. How the heck do you bring all these big climate change issues, the overarching concepts of observation, time, and shifting priorities? How do you do it in your landscape. So the next few slides are going to be about practical steps that you can take. Number one, minimize your lawn. This doesn't have to mean tearing it out. You can see the picture on the left is they just stopped mowing. The picture on the right, they've actively planted a flowering meadow. Lawn, particularly if you're maintaining your lawn, lawn is one of, it's an ecological desert. It provides almost nothing in terms of benefit and is actually very negatively impactful. And depending on where you're located and how you're maintaining it, it can be increasing nutrients into like nitrogen. So when you're putting fertilizer onto your lawn, if it's not all staying on the lawn, it can go into water sources, carbon emissions around maintaining it. And there's no real diversity. It's a monoculture and the roots don't grow very deep. So there's nothing happening in the soil. Lawn is not helpful. I heard someone say lawn should be, an area rug. Also this, I didn't mean to click, but yes, this is my punchline. Lawn has a long history of being an indicator of prestige, status, and wealth. And that goes back to the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. And so this is really, I think it's true. We are not there anymore, and we need our landscapes to reflect that. We need our landscapes to reflect being a part of proactively addressing and mitigating climate change. So lawns are a big piece. There are a lot of great resources there about how to go if you are maintaining a lawn chemically, how to go from a non-chemical lawn to, or from a chemical lawn to a chemical-free lawn, how to have lawn organically. But the big piece, the one that I'd heard is that, again, your lawn should be an area rug and not wall-to-wall carpet. So one of the simplest things you can do is just mow where you need to mow and let the rest go rough. Next is planting native plants. This one, I will say I could talk for weeks on. Planting native plants is one of the most important things you can do. You don't have to plant a lot of native plants. You don't have to have all native plants. There's an initiative called Homegrown National Park by one of the people who really is leading this movement towards wilder landscapes and landscaping and gardening for climate change, Doug Tallamy. Homegrown National Park is trying to get to 70% native plants in your landscape. Anything is better. One plant makes a difference. And some of the reasons for that have to do with coevolution. So coevolution of species that are using our native plants. And the nutritional value of native plants is different and generally more significant, ultimately better for native, for the native fauna, the invertebrates, the moths, the caterpillars, the monarchs, the hummingbirds. So what we've been doing over the last 200 years with this more traditional gardening driven by aesthetics is we've been growing at the horticultural scale and then growing in our own gardens varieties that are cultivars. And they're also exotic. So they're coming from Europe and they're coming from Asia and they're coming from South America. So they really have little to no meaning to the plants and animals around us, well, here on the East Coast. So some of them do provide pollen and they're a food source, but generally speaking, a lot of those cultivars that are food sources are not as nutritionally dense as the native plants would be. Some of them don't provide any nutrition at all. The other piece though too is that our ecosystems aren't just composed of native bees and butterflies. We do have non-native, especially honeybees. So it's not that we need to get rid of all the other plants so that they don't serve a purpose, but planting native plants so that we can create the food source, create the habitat for our native invertebrates and our native ecosystem is really, really key. When you're planting natives, it's important to think about seasons, and it's important to think about ecotypes, and that ties into what are native plants. So what we really look at here, because you have North American native plants, but what's going to grow well here in Massachusetts? Some of the plants that are native to California, they might grow well here, they might not, but again, are they relevant to the birds and the bees that are here? Probably not. So what we start looking at is a native plant is in your ecoregion. There are maps that you can find online that you can type in what's my ecoregion, and you can find out what's, what is your ecoregion. And then there are all sorts of resources for what are those plants. If you go to a local native plant nursery, they will have either ecoregion specific plants or plants that are going to do well here. So that's always a good place to start as well, if you're wondering what is a native plant. One piece that is key and ties into that finding your native plant nursery is sourcing your native plants, knowing what they are, knowing where to find them. But sourcing plants in general, it has increasingly become incredibly important. And going smaller and going local is the best way to go. A lot of the big box stores, even when they have some of the native plants, they're using chemicals called neonicotinoids that are used in large scale commercial growing operations, and they are insecticides. And the plants still have them, they're systemic, so they're in the plant. And so when you plant them, then they're killing insects somewhat indiscriminately. So sourcing your native plants is also key, and trying to stay as local as possible is a good way to go. Another key piece, because the question does come up quite often, what is native? We can be planting for our ecoregion and our ecotype specific. So on Martha's Vineyard, there's a certain kind of switchgrass that is from Martha's Vineyard and not from South Coast of Massachusetts. So some people will start to get more strict around what is my ecotype, and I'm only going to plant that. And just something to think about is when, again, we're tying our gardening and how we're thinking about our garden to climate change, is this idea of assisted migration. And so we sort of look at what's native, what grows here. But I tend to take a less strict view and think about what might need to be growing here as our planting zones shift. If you've heard about that, as things have started to warm up, those gardening zones, those planting zones that gardeners abide by for figuring out what plants will thrive have started to shift. And so there's two parts to that. There's what plants will thrive here is starting to shift. So thinking about what used to only be native as far north as Connecticut is now actually starting to be able to thrive in Massachusetts, thrive in Maine. And because those native plants are tied to specific invertebrates, butterflies, moths, caterpillars that are using those plants as a food source, they're also starting to migrate north as well. So in anticipation of change, one of the things when we're thinking about native plants too is thinking about it's okay, it doesn't have to be super specific to a location, but think about how our landscapes and our gardens are going to help facilitate some of this change over time and really facilitate the birds, bees, butterflies that are trying to coexist with us, our gardens, and these plants and the changes. Another important thing when you're thinking specifically about your garden is planting in layers. And this is all about creating habitat. So when you start to add in layers, you've got your tall layer here, your structural layer. They call this the seasonal theme layer. These are your flowers, maybe grasses, and then your ground cover layer. And this is something that we really almost do not practice at all in typical gardening. What you might see, you can see it everywhere. You can look out a window probably and see maybe a neighbor's garden or your own garden where we plant a plant on its own, and then we put a bunch of mulch around it, and then we plant another plant 3 or 4 feet away. There's all sorts of books and research on soil health and trees and thinking about how those plants want to live in community. They want the roots in the ground are creating support system for the plants, particularly in times of stress. There's resource sharing that is happening. And so when we plant those plants on their own in the middle of a bed of mulch, we're we're not really doing anything for the environment in a lot of ways. Yes, if you've planted a milkweed, you've provided a food source for a monarch butterfly. But what we're really losing is opportunity for varied habitat for different types of butterflies and moths and bees. We're not really adding to any of the diversity underground with the different types of roots and different depths of roots. And we are, again, missing an opportunity for creating additional food sources. So what this really looks like is you've got your taller plants, you've got a mid layer, and then you've got a ground cover layer. And that ground cover layer is the one we do the least, I'd say, in typical gardening. But starting to add in those plants that creep are essential. It gives you additional habitat, additional food source. And for anyone who's gardened, it's your living mulch. So the more ground cover you get in there intentionally, the fewer weeds you will have. So there's definitely a practical element as well. And the other piece too, on that sort of gardening practical piece, is when you start to think about plants in communities and plant them in communities, you're covering a lot more of your soil, and you, two things, have fewer weeds or you don't notice your weeds. So when you're thinking about, again, the practicalities of some of these things, planting in these layers is key for the environment, for us as gardeners. Next, that should be number 4, apologies, but one of the most, again, this is a big shift for all of us. And in a lot of ways, if you're a gardener and you like flowers, and how we've been gardening again is for the aesthetics, the soil can feel like the less fun piece, but the soil is one of the most important things we can focus on when it comes to climate change. And this applies to food, this applies to your landscapes, and to your gardens. We need healthy soil. Most of our soils, built soils that have been disturbed, our agricultural soils, are not particularly healthy, because again, we've been focusing on what's above ground and what we want, our imposed needs, whether it's corn or roses. We've been thinking about that surface level, and then we've been applying chemicals and fertilizers and really band-aid solutions that give us that immediate response. What we really need to do, and this is where it takes time, is we need to build up our soil health, and we need to know it. So that's observation, that's taking the time to understand different areas on your property, in your garden, on your farm, and understanding what's already there and why it's there. Why is this section more acidic? Why is this section wetter? When soil is healthy, it's contributing micronutrients that we need, if we're, particularly if we're growing vegetables, but that plants need and that invertebrates need. It's doing work to clean. So water that passes through healthy soil is having nutrients removed, and that makes a difference. Even the stormwater coming off your house, if it's just running over a lawn, it's picking up pollutants along the way. If it's allowed to, if it's being absorbed by a healthier soil, that soil is actually removing pollutants before it goes into the storm drain, which then goes into your watershed. And that could be a harbor, that could be a wetland. And it's really decreasing, when you have healthy soil, you're decreasing pests and disease. And this is something, again, as gardeners and farmers, we do a lot of above ground application to try and get rid of all these different pests. If you are building healthy soil, you will have healthier plants. And I've put here, know it. So that really is, again, get to know it, dig some up, soak it in water, see how long the water takes to go down, watch how different plants are thriving in your landscape, cover it. That has to do with the ground cover. That's your living mulch. And if you have to use mulch because you're working towards living mulch, ground cover plants, that's fine. But cover it, because you start to lose a lot of your soil nutrients when it's exposed to wind and rain. And then over time, build it up, increase the soil health. This really applies to, the building up really applies to some of the more intensive things that you might want to be growing, roses or vegetables. I'll come back to it, but I really like to know my soil and then do something that's called right plant, right place. So we'll come back to that in a second, but building up
Rita,
soil
Rita,
is
let me
one.
just say real quick,
Wait,
just want to give you a heads up on time. We're just at 20 minutes before the hour. Just want to let you know
okay,
that.
all right. Thank you. Here's a couple books about, again, what's going on beneath the ground. The Hidden Half of Nature really looks at the gardens. The Finding the Mother Tree is talking about that resource sharing. So coming back to, we're now going to take this big beast of climate change and we're going to apply it to our gardens, and we're thinking about what we can do in our own backyard. And again, knowing your soil, covering your soil, very practical steps, starting small. All of the things that we've been talking about, shifting priorities are big changes. And starting small, it's a new way of gardening. It's a new way of planning your garden. It's a new way of thinking about your garden. Start small, watch, and then add. Right plant, right place. So for me, what I really think about is, again, I'm not building up my soil. I'm not trying to grow anything intensive. So I'm going to know what plants want poor soil, what plants want good soil, sun, shade, all those pieces, and putting the plant in the right place at the right time. Sourcing mindfully. I call this thinking of a Monet. Again, when we're talking about some of these big shifts around completely changing the way that we garden, the way we think about our garden, it may not be beautiful to you. So think of it as a Monet. Put it across the yard, make it a small pocket, start to get used to what native plants look like, what a garden that is maintained differently looks like. We're very used to it looking the way we want it to look and having a lot of control over it. So think of your native garden, especially the first time you're introducing native plants and gardening for climate change. You want to see it from afar. It may not be so comfortable up close. And then maintaining for habitat and food source. This is about a lighter footprint on our landscapes and the way that we maintain. One of the things that you may have heard about is no mow May, and this also applies to the rest of your garden. Not cutting things down too early because there are invertebrates that overwinter in various places in our yard. And so when we cut those down too early, we are getting rid of that habitat and potentially devastating anyone that's been trying to overwinter. And just quickly, that this is what it can look like. They can be ground nesting. They can be stem and wood nesting. So this is where we're not cutting our plants down. We're leaving them up as a source of food for birds, as habitat for overwintering invertebrates, and then cavity nesting, which can happen at the base of plants. And lastly, again, basic tips, bringing climate change into how we think about our gardens. Again, observe, be patient, let go of a little bit of the control. Gardening, the very first gardens, the gardens of Babylon, were all about keeping the wild out. And we have to let the wild back in. And that is letting go of control, letting things creep and move and respond to climate change. And again, get ready to be uncomfortable. This may not be beautiful at first, but what I've said to many people and what I felt is when you start to see the bees and the butterflies come back, it becomes incredibly beautiful. And going back to the idea of time, while everything in the garden takes time, the one thing that is almost immediate is when you plant a native plant. I've done this. I planted an Ohio buckeye. By the time I sat down, there were 2 hummingbirds on the Ohio buckeye. Same thing this year. I planted honeysuckle. It bloomed for the first time. The hummingbirds were there. You bring in a native plant, and almost immediately you will see a change in who is coming to your garden, and that's what we need. So just quickly, I'm going to show you some things in practice. This was that meadow that I talked about. This was the lawn that was heavily maintained. We completely got rid of irrigation, all nutrient additions, and this is now an amazing habitat for all sorts of birds and butterflies and other invertebrates. This is another one. This is a very poorly maintained lawn, which is actually okay if you're going to have lawn, but it was too much lawn. They didn't need all of it, but they also didn't want maintenance. This is the exact same view So we brought in, these are all native plants in here, and it softens the view and you can't even see it, but there's a pocket of lawn, an area rug of lawn in the back there for grandkids. This is one that demonstrates what can happen just by not mowing. So this is year to year, almost the same view. These are all native plants in here. They're there, they want to be there. And so again, this is that idea of observing and thinking about what wants to be here, what would be here if I wasn't here, what was here before. That is what we need to start to recreate. This is one where we more actively, so we treated this as a garden and we just use native plants. So here we're gardening and using some of those classic design principles of aesthetics, of placement, and just using native plants. So we're increasing the food source, we're increasing the habitat, we're increasing the diversity. This is another one, same idea here on the left, we're just using native plants. So they can be quite colorful and they can, I mean, this is more of a wilder aesthetic, but you know, they are beautiful. And then on the bottom right, you're seeing one where we shifted the mowing. That's all we did, and we decreased the lawn. And that can have an incredible impact. And then here, I did just want to show you exactly what I am doing in my own landscape. So if you can orient yourself, I showed that picture before of the foxglove in my front porch. So this is thinking about your garden design. And one thing that I haven't mentioned, because I am not a purist, have the lilacs, have the peonies, have the plants that bring you joy. What I've noted here are the different zones of my garden. So I've spent 2 years watching my garden, learning, and these numbers here, oops, go back. These numbers here are speaking to that idea of the homegrown national park. So this Irish granny garden is where I keep the plants that I love and enjoy and are not native close to my house. I can enjoy them. There's one of each. They're protected from wildlife. And I've got narrow borders and a lot of wild plants. Native plants want more space. So that's my Irish granny garden. And I'm 80% non-native, 20% native. I've got over here my death corner. I've been doing this 15 years. I still have a death corner. So again, you have to learn to know how to matter how much you know. Everyone might have a death corner. I planted a magnolia there my first year. By the time I got back to the front door, it had died pretty closely. This soil is horrible. So what's going to work there? It's the toughest of the tough native plants. Sneezeweed, asters, boltonia. And here I've got 20% non-native, 80% native. Roadside buffer, I'm doing the same thing. It's a very hard place for plants to grow. The natives will love it. And then over here, I call this my breaking the rules beds. So everyone, this is where I think really all principles of old landscape design and gardening out the window. We need to rethink our landscapes, our gardens, the way we interact with nature. So this is where I experiment with doing all the things that you're not supposed to do, like planting small plants up near the house, letting the viola ground cover take over. And that's my experimental. This is how I'm treating my landscape, thinking about climate change. And here are some pictures. So again, this is my granny corner, and building off of that, I've got lilacs, I've got foxglove and honeysuckle. I snuck in a goldenrod. This is the picture on the right, probably looks pretty boring. This is a really good example of how I've even really thought about how to shift the way I treat my landscape. This is a red maple, a sugar maple, and what you can't see is on that red maple, there's a branch that goes directly out perpendicular to the ground. The old gardening me would think that needs to be cleaned up and we need to get rid of it because it looks funny, and I'd get rid of those dead branches. After watching it for 2 years, there's also honeysuckle, invasive honeysuckle growing on that branch. So what we've all learned about invasives is pull them out, get rid of them. Watching this space for 2 years, the woodpeckers love the dead wood. That puts the aesthetics, the branch that goes out, yeah, it still kind of bothers me, but what it's doing is it's creating this amazing habitat where the honeysuckle and a native catbrier are this safe space for birds. Every single bird on the property darts into that safe space because everything else is kind of open. And so when I was thinking about what am I going to do, I'm not going to just tear out the natives. This is creating habitat. And now that we are prioritizing habitat, I'm going to figure out how to replace that habitat. So I'm going to take a native climber called the Clematis virginiana. I'm going to plant it there. I'm going to let it grow up and over. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to cut the honeysuckle out. Just cut the honeysuckle, leave it, pull out the roots, because what we've been doing, and even I've been doing this, I've pulled out so many invasives. And when you really go for it and pull out invasives, you're leaving a gap. And one of the biggest problems we're seeing with landscapes, our landscapes, and it's no longer a canary in the coal mine situation where it's like, oh, there might be a problem here. We're seeing a decline in backyard birds. We're seeing a decline in robins, in crows, in sparrows. That's when we know we have gone to a point with our landscapes that is serious, because they can survive just about anything. So every opportunity you have to hold your habitat or build it, keep it. Bringing it back to Frogfoot Farm quickly, this is how we're doing that at the farm. We have our crops. We have a berm that has a practical function here that is a windbreak, but we're planting it all with natives and we're doing it in layers. So we'll have our ground cover, we'll have our mid layer, we'll have our upper layer, that is the windbreak. We're creating undisturbed ground nesting habitat for native bees, both social and solitary, that want to be in sand. Oh gosh, sorry, I keep doing that. And then we've got our more flowery pollinator strip and our deer fence. So all the same principles built into Frogfoot Farm, so at the farm scale. Another piece in blue, this is something I haven't mentioned yet, but it's important, is understanding microclimates that happen on your property. So on the bottom of these berms, even though we have a really open, exposed, sandy site, we're anticipating that there's going to be a little more water collection and it will naturally run off of the berms, settle down in here. So that microclimates are an opportunity to increase biodiversity, plant more plants. So we'll hopefully be able to plant some low bush blueberries or other water loving perennials. These are 2 books.
Hey, Rita, I just want to make sure that I do get to a few of the questions that were asked. So I want to go ahead and switch over.
Okay, I can end there. Wow.
Well, sorry, actually, do you want to go all the way to your resources page real quick and show the resources? Okay.
Yeah.
As we wrap up.
I'll just skip through. Really, the wrap up is about resiliency. And maybe before we go to resiliency, I'm just going to come right back here, because all the other ones are really tying this back to climate change. When we're talking about climate change in the gardens, we're talking about building resiliency. And resiliency has to do with health, health at all levels. And to build resiliency in the garden, again, observing and being patient, prioritizing habitat and food sources, minimizing your effort and inputs, and what I'm calling make your garden a MacGyver garden. We need diversity. Resiliency is about being able to adapt to climate change, and adapting to climate change. What that means is we don't really know what's coming, so we have to be prepared for a little bit of everything. And so when you think about what you're going to do in your garden and how you're going to shift it towards a more climate-friendly garden, focus on diversity, focus on other things besides us that want to be in that landscape, because that is how we build resiliency and health. All right. Resources. Are there questions in the chat?
Yeah, let's go ahead and switch over. We've got about 5 minutes, so I'll go through quite quickly. At least we can cover a couple. But I did mention that if we don't get your question today, I'll make sure that Rita sends you an email back with an answer. Can you recommend, in addition to plants that are drought tolerant, can you recommend some plants that animals don't like, i.e., groundhogs, rabbits, chipmunks, and squirrels?
So I will say, if you have all of those at the same time, that is a very hard situation to garden in. So that's where you might want to think about some kind of protection. Can list them off. This is probably a good one to send an email, but Baptisia, figwort, goldenrods. Goldenrods are great. There's all different kinds. Sneezeweed, geraniums, salvias, black-eyed Susans, mountain mint, asters. Those are the ones that I think of immediately. And I've leaned towards the native plants. And then I would also say, if you're dealing with that much wildlife, plant the things that are important to you close to the house. Utilize, you can get all natural deer and rabbit sprays that are cinnamon based and garlic oil based. And you need to do that once a week and after it rains at the start of the season. And also know that your plants are most appealing to wildlife when you've just planted them, when they've just come from the nursery or from when they're just coming up in the spring. So if you're going to use spray as a protection, focus on those times.
Awesome, thank you. And maybe now, if you want to stop the screen share before we go into another question, then we'll be able to probably summarize a few things. Yeah, so I wanted to point out, so there was a question that was submitted in advance. We got to that one, and now I can switch over to some that came into the chat. What kind of cover crop would work on a 4x4 raised bed for veggies?
One of my favorite cover crops at the moment is buckwheat. It's an annual and it gets a lot of covered in flowers, which is good for pollinators, covered in white flowers. And it's one of the cover crops that will go away easily and is easy to get rid of when you're ready. If you're thinking more about over time, to me, that one cover crop is a placeholder until you're doing the next thing. But if you're thinking about rotating over time, then you want to use a couple different types of cover crops, and those can be red clover, white clover, partridge pea, buckwheat, rye. Those are ones that we'll be using at Frogfoot. And I think that's something we can share as well. We can think about more.
Yeah, awesome. A couple of the questions came in that kind of would be another hour, maybe a lot of content. One of them is just really about how, if we're doing all this work as individuals in our homes, how can we get municipalities and our neighbors involved? And that seems like we would need to have another session.
Yeah.
Do you have any resources on that?
Definitely the sort of general resources that I put out there: Grow Native Massachusetts, Berkshire Botanical Gardens, Xerces Society. Especially, they talk about things at scale. What I find is most important when you're trying to do this at scale, and this goes all the way back to that idea of shifting baseline, is people need to see it. They need to see it in action. When they can walk down the street and they're a little bit afraid of it might be messy or it might be ugly, or you don't know how to maintain it. And not knowing how to maintain it is a problem. So doing it in your own backyard is a great way to start and show people this is what it looks like. It's not that scary and it can be quite beautiful. And then how to do it. University of Rhode Island has some great resources. NOFA, Connecticut. We're in Ecoregion 59. So they have a project called Ecotype 59. A lot of great resources there. But really, people need to see it to know that it can be beautiful, and they need to know how to maintain it. And getting those resources together are key.
Awesome. Okay. Well, I think at this point, since we're just about at 1 o'clock at our hour, I will go ahead and wrap it up. And thank everybody for coming today. If you check your chat, a lot of people had shared some links and some very interesting resources were shared from the group. So I'm really appreciating that right now. This again will be a recording will be sent to you, plus the slides will be sent to you. So you'll have those resources in your inbox tomorrow. And hopefully just want to make sure that you are getting our emails and our events and keeping connected and staying connected. And with that, I will keep our Zoom room open for a little while if you have anything further for Rita, but I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and wave goodbye to those who are leaving you. Thank you.